Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican politics podcast. I'm your co-host, José Granados Ceja, Mexican-born journalist living and working in Mexico City, staff writer and host of the podcast over at Venezuela Analysis. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Doing very well, José Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin magazine in the United States and Sentido Común here in Mexico, ready for another episode of Soberanía.
Excellent. So can you believe it? We made it to the end. That's it. The election period is virtually over. So here in Mexico, we have an official campaign period, which ends shortly before Election Day. So as of Thursday, there's no campaigning allowed. If I'm not mistaken, there's also no publishing of surveys, of opinion surveys and the like. So it's pretty much everything will be over in a matter of days. So this will go up tomorrow, Tuesday. And Wednesday is the end of the campaign. Claudia Sheinbaum will be hosting her big final rally here in the Zócalo. It'll be interesting to see the turnout. I expect likely it'll be a pretty good crowd that shows up. It's always interesting to see what happens when it comes to the mobilization of Morena's grassroots rank and file, because, you know, it's a challenge. The Zócalo is a big square. And I remember when they held their kickoff rally back in March, that you and I both went to, we saw how they were able to fill the Zócalo, right? And I remember Claudia Sheinbaum afterwards was like, we were nervous because it's the first time we had called people to the Zócalo without having López Obrador be the main person there. Obviously, being the president, he's not allowed to participate directly, intervene directly in the election. So we're at the end, and I figured that we would do a little bit of an evaluation, kind of talk about everything that's happened so far. What do things look like on the eve of the election, which will be happening this coming Sunday, June 2nd. And we'll have the results that night. Actually, we should mention that we're going to be doing some special programming as well, hopefully doing a live if we're able to get to a place with a good signal, because it does get very, very busy. We'll be able to kind of give a reaction directly from the results. We'll have the preliminary count as well.
We'll be there on Sunday.
Early.
Yep. And we'll find a way to do a live. Yeah, if we
All
can
right, then. In that case, there you have it. Kurt, he's made the commitment. He's put us in that spot now. We're going to be live
right there.
On
boom,
Sunday.
boom, boom, boom. Yeah.
So look forward to that, and maybe we can have some friends come along as well, because it's going to be an exciting night. And I think we should begin by giving a look at the opposition, because obviously this was a race that largely boiled down to these two candidates, although there's something to be said about Movimiento Ciudadano here in the tail end with Jorge Álvarez Mañez. It was actually a pretty major incident that made a lot of headlines, even internationally. We'll get into that later in the program, but thought we would start here. Kurt, talk to us about the opposition and their evolution, if we want to say, from the beginning of the race to today. Where are they at?
Yeah. Just to sum it up very concisely, as I said here in the tweet that you see on the screen, and I'll read it for those listening on audio, in its final and agonizing days, the Xochitl Gálvez campaign is going from being a bad campaign to a contemptible campaign. The first of those you can recover from over time.
Sure.
The second, not so much. Now, what do I mean by that? We've talked about amply on this program about how gaffe-prone Xochitl Gálvez has proven to be, throughout the campaign. Really, and it's not an exaggeration to say, there hasn't practically been a day that hasn't gone by with her on the campaign trail that she hasn't come out with something just ridiculous or off, or the gum on the chair, or just a couple days ago she tried to talk about crime statistics and got the number garbled. The teleprompter issue and where's my iPad, and it's just been a gaffe fest over there. Now, she's a poor candidate. That was a poor choice, right? That's one thing. But what's happened in these final weeks has been a real transformation of a bad campaign into really an ugly campaign. And we saw this in the third debate when she tried to go after, just for example, she tried to go after the head of Morena, the president of the Morena party, Mario Delgado, saying that he's being investigated in the United States for connections with huachicoleros. And it wasn't Mario Delgado at all. It was another person named Mario Delgado, right?
I actually couldn't believe that. I had to double check. I was like, did they really make
They really
this
do that?
big of a mistake? Did they really do this? And yeah, sure enough, turns out the big major takeaway for her team, for her campaign from the third debate was this accusation that Mario Delgado is being investigated in the United States. And it turns out it's just somebody with the same name. Extraordinary. How do you not do your basic homework on that one? But it kind of speaks to, just like you said, where this campaign began and where it ended. And if you were to ask me, it ended in a much worse place. And
They ended in
actually,
a much
I
worse place.
think they're going to struggle to come back from this because there's probably going to be down ballot consequences from this. So it's one thing to have a bad candidate at the top, but that means that people won't turn out to vote, or they're not motivated, or they're not convinced. So either they stay home, or they are actually, if they're going to turn out to vote and they were on the fence, they may ultimately vote for Claudia Sheinbaum, despite the fact that that was a group of a segment of the population that would have been interested in voting for the opposition and voting out for the opposition down the ballot. And so I think what we are likely to see is a resounding victory for Morena, not just for the presidency, but in the majority of the states that are facing governorship elections, and I think quite easily are going to win a comfortable majority, maybe even the supermajority, which is what they're pushing for.
And she's really dug her own hole on this, right? The Xochitl Galvez campaign really never figured out what it wanted to be. On one hand, she said she had been a youth Trotskyite, right, to try to give herself cred as having been, a young progressive. But then she's really ending the campaign, flirting with the far right. We'll see a tweet here in a minute where they're trying to resurrect the attack lines from the 2006 campaign, kind of mouthing some of the language of Javier Milei, right? On one hand, as we've talked about, they've been hysterical about not wanting to be perceived as canceling the social programs, when it's well known that both her and her surrogates think that the social programs create dependence, right? And then just the nastiness, right? Xochitl Galvez has gone after Claudia Sheinbaum's father and a business that he had, tried to go after the house that she had with her ex-husband, and tried to insinuate that there was something shady about the house that they had built in Tlalpan. She even went after the fact that Claudia Sheinbaum wore a skirt with the Virgin of Guadalupe logo on it, right, when she was over in Italy, with a very clear dog whistle that Claudia is Jewish and she's not one of us, right? That's how nasty Xochitl has gotten. And we talked about this in the last episode. And it's really interesting that if anyone has family matters that could have been exploited, it's Xochitl Galvez. Right?
Her sister.
The video came out during the campaign of her son, a classic junior or Mireille, out in front of an exclusive club in Polanco, hitting and insulting the bouncers and even the cops, right? Pushing at the cops and such, right? The famous Donde están tus putos huevos video, right? Her daughter with multiple birth certificates to have, try to manage their business empire off of public contracts. And, the real scandal here, and this isn't Xochitl's fault, is she has a sister in prison who's accused of kidnapping. If the Claudia campaign had wanted to go as much in the gutter as the Galvez campaign, all of those would have been issues. And they weren't. Claudia said from the beginning, we're not touching family issues. We're not touching family issues because you're not responsible for your family, right? Now, she is responsible for her son and daughter who she put in campaign roles. She's not responsible for her sister, right? That, I think, right there gives you an insight into the two campaigns. Because Xochitl, as her campaign has kind of slowly, a slow motion crash and burn, has tried everything. And this has been the problem. It's been a real scattershot series of attacks, going from Claudia's family to her, to her ethnic background, to, claiming that violence has gone up in Mexico City when it clearly hasn't, to simply lying about the facts, to calling her a narco candidate, a narco party, a cold authoritarian woman. her campaign or others suggesting that they're going to close churches, that they're going to close the Basilica of Guadalupe, that they want to sell actions in Pemex, that people with Morena vests are going to your house and saying that they're going to cancel the social programs if you don't vote for them. I mean, really, it's just been, surrogates of hers like Macario Schettino saying that if you are voting for Morena, you're either a tonto or you're a son of a bitch.
Wow.
This is where they've gotten to. Right? This is in their desperation and their anger and their meanness, right? And their inability to see outside of their bubble. This is what I mean. So I quite agree with Javier Tello when he says this isn't as much of a campaign that's gone negative in the Jorge Castaneda sense. It's a campaign that's gone ridiculous. No, Jose Luis?
Oh, and there's a lot of voices out there who are almost trying to get us to pity her at this point. Oh, poor Xochitl Galvez, she didn't know what she got into, and now she's clearly not having a good time. But honestly, I think she deserves to shoulder the responsibility for this, right? I don't actually have a lot of sympathy for her. She's the one who decided to run in this election, to run on behalf of the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD, to put her name forward, to go out there and campaign, and therefore should attend to the consequences of that. And if that means that you are now going to have to kind of disappear after the election and fade into the background, then so be it, right? Let that be the case for Xochitl Galvez. Now, obviously, she's a human being and we should keep things political, but her gaffes, her political decisions, she should take responsibility for. So therefore, no sympathy from me in that sense. And not to mention that, I think a lot of it is partially driven. She may try to give off this persona as being, somebody who is happy and laughing and is a different kind of candidate or a different kind of politician. But ultimately, as we saw in these last 3 months, she was very much the same kind of politician that we've come to expect from the pre-PAN coalition. This kind of attitude, this desprecio, this disregard for your opponent and their supporters. And so if ultimately this means that she disappears from the limelight, which I imagine that's kind of my expectation after she takes the loss, well, then so be it. I also think that the parties, the leadership of the PRI and the PAN are going to blame her. They're going to say this is everybody's fault.
They're going to use her as the scapegoat, clearly. Yeah.
And they're like, well, we made a mistake, or it turns out she wasn't a good candidate. But let's remind everybody, she was put there. She loves to say on the campaign trail, 1 million people signed so that I would be the citizen candidate. It's not true at all. Their whole campaign ended up being, selection process ended up being aborted because there was a decision that came from the top to decide who the candidate was going to be, obeying a certain logic that they thought that during the campaign, somebody with her profile was going to be able to do better than she ultimately did. And, well, now we see that that's not the case.
And I think you're absolutely right. The image they tried to project of Xochitl Galvez is somebody who is funny, witty, quick on her feet, happy-go-lucky, bike riding, kind of someone you want to hang out with, right? Whereas Claudia their idea was to attempt to paint her as distant, cold, scientific, right? Not somebody you'd want to hang out with, right? And, as somebody pointed out, whether I want to hang out with someone or not, if there's a problem, if there's a serious problem in this country, who do we want to be president? That was the question there, right? But, none of that turned out to be the Xochitl Galvez we saw on the campaign trail. It was someone who was gaffe-prone, who was dependent on teleprompters and iPads, who couldn't speak off the cuff, who couldn't be spontaneous and funny, and actually was very angry. Was very angry, right? These kind of comments on the campaign trail, and dismissive. Like, if you're 60 years old and haven't yet, gotten a patrimony for yourself, like a house, right, money in the bank, then you're away, you're away. Basically, you're a loser, more or less, right? In a country where it's been historically so difficult because of the cartel of banks, because of high interest rates, because of difficulties in getting mortgages, because of low salaries, right? To set up people to not be able to do something and then blame them for not doing it is the classic panista, double bind. And she was just so dismissive of that when it came out during the campaign repeatedly that she has companies that have benefited, abundantly from federal contracts. conflicts of interests, right? Crony contacts. That's the way you build your patrimony? And if you don't do that, then you're the loser.
And you're
Right?
Yeah, which is why,
How
again,
does
I
that
wanted
come
to...
across to people? What was she thinking? Right? It's like Taboada coming out 2 weeks ago and saying we're going to raise the metro. It's that kind of tone deafness. And I have another comment in a minute, but let's get maybe to some of these other nasty comments here, because it's really, as the ship crashes and burns, some of these people are allowing themselves to crash and burn with it. So let's see some of these.
Have here, I think what I call it an echo of 2006, right? It's a pretty simple tweet, put it up 21 hours ago, recording today on Monday. It says, Claudia Sheinbaum is a danger for our democracy. And it has echoes of that 2006 campaign against López Obrador saying he's a danger for Mexico. This is the narrative, which is, again, why I will not sympathize with a member of Mexico's bourgeoisie, of Mexico's ruling class, who ran a bad campaign and ultimately turned to these kinds of strategies. And I want to actually read out here what Carlos Pérez Ricard said in response, and I think actually quite sums it up quite well, because there is a certain sense of disappointment about the way that things played out. This wasn't really so much an opposition campaign interested in making proposals. Like you said, it was scattershot. It's hard for me to even pin down. If you were to ask me what were some of their major proposals, no, ultimately it was this. It was this kind of this campaign. And so I'll read it out to you here. So when it was confirmed that the two women candidates would compete for the presidency of Mexico, many of us, it seemed like an excellent opportunity to show that the campaigns could be done in a different way, without returning to those old dirty tactics of the past, and that style of easily disqualifying your opponent. Unfortunately, it was not like this. The Xochitl Gálvez campaign was hostile, belligerent, undermined, disqualified. Today, and looking for a last-ditch effort to save herself, she recovers an old phrase from 2006, to return 18 years ago to confirm what we always knew. The candidate did not understand the historical moment that it was demanding. And so her name will be lost in the footnotes in the books of history. I couldn't agree more. I think he hit the nail on the head, and it's what we've been talking about just here, is that ultimately somebody who could have maybe introduced a little more substantive discussion to the debate ultimately ended up doing old attacks, dog whistles, campaign gaffes. I mean, just recently she was in Chiapas and she talks about how I'm an indigenous woman and I understand your needs, and then says, Viva PRI, Viva PAN, Viva PRD, right? And somebody in the crowd has to be like, Viva Chiapas, right? So insisting, right? Like you're not even thinking about the country you're
where you
in.
are, who you're interacting with, what you're doing.
It's so simple. It's like a rock band not saying the name of the city that they're playing in. Come on, this is campaigning 101. And I know campaigns matter. It's interesting because I think a lot of them really did expect that the campaign was going to turn their fortunes around or at least improve. Ultimately, I think they went in the opposite direction. And it shows that, campaigns do matter, but you have to run a good one. And they ran a really bad one. And they're going to pay for it.
They are. And, just as a very quick historical, aside, para los jóvenes, as AMLO says, right, who maybe don't remember the 2006 campaign, it was a nasty campaign centered around this idea that AMLO was a danger for Mexico, right? And this was a campaign thought up by Antonio Solá, the Spanish consultant, and Dick Morris from the U.S., and with a lot of dirty money, of course, from, funneled in through Vicente Fox and, the business roundtable groups and the Consejo Empresarial and all of this. So, you would see ads of your house crumbling around you, because there was going to be hyper devaluation and hyperinflation and whatever else, right? The real gutter scare tactics, right? And the left hadn't governed, so there was a degree more of susceptibility to it, and it was really the first campaign in Mexico that had such a degree of negative ads, right? Now people are much more inured to them, but in 2006 it was more of a novelty, right? Very nasty campaign with a lot of illegal financing. All around this idea that AMLO was, not only wrong, but a danger to Mexico. And this is what this tweet is trying to evoke here.
And I think that partially explains why these same dinosaurs from many years ago are popping up again and showing their face and trying to make appeals to vote for the opposition candidate. I think they're scared because they understand. The reason they were scared in 2006 that López Obrador would assume the presidency is because they knew that history would prove them wrong, that a López Obrador government wouldn't be a disaster for the country, that it wouldn't lead to hyperinflation and the devaluation of the peso, as we saw in this last sexenio. We saw a relatively stable macroeconomic policy. We saw a drop in poverty. We saw actually the peso strengthen against the dollar. Whatever metric you want to use, right? It was not what they predicted. And then so they knew that it would make, they knew that it would make this election a lot easier for the incumbent party, as we've seen, that at no point was really the election ever in danger for Claudia Sheinbaum. But I was talking about these dinosaurs, and I saw this hilarious cartoon here from Moneda Hernandez here, because Enrique Krause, believe it or not, gosh, it was awful. I don't know if you saw the video, but it was just kind of like this, like, oh, listen to me, young kids. Let me tell you about what it means to defend democracy in this country. I was involved in '68 and all this kind of stuff. The kind of messaging from his generation that is just totally out of touch. And I think this captures it perfectly. Somebody pretending that they're going to be able to appeal to young people, but it's completely transparent, just like the meme.
Yeah, and so there's Enrique Krause, who trotted out his number, Eugenio Derbez, the actor, and Héctor Aguilar Camín, right? Our favorite oligar Camín, right? In a similar vein to Enrique Krause, lamenting the good old days when they were subsidized by the federal government, their magazines, their publishing ventures, their projects, their personal lives, right? So what, as Oligar Camín says here, is there was a cultural policy that was profoundly generous, profoundly generous to them, and profoundly free, right? In the sense of even things that were critical of the PRI were financed by governmental funds. Well, of course, they had to finance something that was critical, otherwise it would have been pretty obvious, right? There wasn't this conditioning, right, that there is now, not only with the cultural community, but with beneficiaries from social programs. There was, we felt that we were apapachot by, we felt that we were embraced by the federal government, right? And as I put there, and this is a personal issue to me, but to a lot of us, we have a publishing house here in Oaxaca. It's called Matanga Taller Editorial. We publish Oaxacan authors of short stories and novels. We love what we do, right? In addition to the journalism, this is another thing that I do. But it's very hard. It's very hard work to have a small press. It's very difficult, right? And in part, it's so difficult because for years, the cultural money in this country was sucked up by these, vividores, people who lived off this largesse, these apapachos. So a good infrastructure was not created to support smaller initiatives or to even recognize their existence, just to recognize their existence, right? Nobody's asking for a dime, right? Like our projects, there are hundreds of projects throughout the country that, as I put here in the tweet, that are fighting without rest in anonymity, right? So with this this group of people to then self-proclaim themselves to be the cultural community is a bad joke. This is what they want to go back to. The organic intellectuals, as they're called here in Mexico, who prided themselves not only on being, right, the house historians or the house opinologists or the house pundits, but also, right, the house cultural people, right? The house novelists and, poets and artists. all to try to sell this regime to the world.
Yeah.
That's what they did. You explained it very well in the last episode, right? The PRI as the hegemonic party co-opted the artistic community very well. When that hegemony began to crumble, they set up the managed democracy phase to give, the appearance of democracy, right? The pre-pon switching back and forth and whatever else, without actually creating a democracy where anything was fundamental was ever going to really change. These people were fundamental to that. So they were not only, right, the cultural community, but they were the people who pride themselves on delivering democracy to Mexico. As in the most counter-historical fashion possible, the elites decided to bestow democracy on the people. Something that's never happened anywhere in the history of humanity. But they try to pass themselves off as this, right?
And then get mad at us for not being
Illuminati who bestowed democracy on the people. And are now the guardians against the restoration of authoritarianism, which for them is they're not getting their magazines bought.
I think a lot of it boils down to that. I think all of it's just they're resentful that they're not at the center of the picture anymore, that they're not the ones getting the grants, they're not the ones getting their magazines purchased, they're not the ones, they can't pick up the phone and have a direct line to the executive anymore. A lot of it's just that resentment. And then they're resentful of us for daring to be grateful for a different kind of exercise of democracy in this country. And that's incredibly frustrating. And who are these characters? Well, it's the Claudia Gonzalez, right? I mean, you can see it here. You have a great comment here. This is the face of defeat. And it absolutely is. I'm going to let it play without any sound. But just watch his face.
You don't even have to understand what he's saying. Just watch his face.
I mean, he's clearly upset. He's like, everything I tried to set up faltered. It didn't work. Right now, he's literally talking. He's like, oh, this is the size of the morality of López Obrador.
He said AMLO is a moral dwarf, right? The guy who's a junior funded by his daddy and USAID is calling AMLO the moral dwarf, right?
And so, I mean, I think I wonder if there'll be a reckoning for him. I expect that the parties will also say maybe we shouldn't have run in a grand coalition together. It was never going to work, but we listened to this guy because he was paying salaries for all of our staff to be in all of these AstroTurf organizations, right? That's the face of the old regime. And it's angry. And it's angry because the population is clearly intending to vote against his interests.
Remember when he said a few years ago, this guy, Claudia Gonzalez, that we've got a list. When we're going to make a list of everybody who betrayed the country from when we go back into power, right?
Yeah.
This was him.
Yeah, they're vengeful, which is also a risk, right? If they ever should return to power, they would absolutely take revenge upon everybody. Like, how dare you? Now you're going to pay. So, like I said, we're looking at the polls. It doesn't look like that's going to happen in this election cycle. We'll be here to give you analysis throughout the next sexennial as well.
Just one point on this to maybe round this out. They're angry, as we've seen here, and it's an irrational anger. Right? Because actually, if you kind of look at the balance sheets, they have no reason to be angry, right? AMLO hasn't raised taxes on the rich, should have. Hasn't raised capital gains tax, which is very low in Mexico. I think it's just 10%, right? Hasn't touched these big corporations, right? Now, they've had to they have to pay more in contributions to their employees for their Social Security contributions, an increase in vacation days, an increase in aguinaldo, which is Christmas bonus, right? There are costs like that have gone up, right? But the very wealthy have done very well under AMLO, right? Probably too well, right? So. If you look at it from kind of a rational point of view, they have no reason to be upset. They have no reason to be upset, right? They've had to pay back taxes that they owed. They're allowing they can't condone taxes like previously, right? Stuff like that, right? They can't outsource core functions like they used to be able to, right? So in that sense, yes. But these people aren't hurting at all.
No, and I think there's something interesting
at all. So the hate is exactly what you said. It's irrational. It's the irrational hate of feeling themselves to be displaced from their rightful position in society, according to them, by a guy who talks funny, who has a Tabascan accent, who grew up in Macuspana, who's slept outside in the Zocalo in a tent, who's not one of them, and who makes fun of them, which they can't stand because they're very self-important, very self-serious people, right? They can't handle that. But that irrational hate at the same time does not allow them to make an argument as to why this government is so bad. Because most of the arguments are irrational, right? He's an authoritarian, he's a dictator, he's this, he's that. The government is this, the government is that. You can't run a campaign out of irrational hate. That will help you with your fellow haters, right, and your burbuja there, and that will rouse the passions of the people who already agree with you. But irrational hate is no basis for a cogent, coherent campaign message. Because if they were going to be honest, they'd simply say, we've been displaced and we want to get back to where we think we're supposed to be.
That's
not a winning message.
If there's one word for it, it's entitlement. It's this idea that they should be the ones who are actually running the show because apparently we can't, or we're too stupid or ignorant to do it. That's the attitude. And then we've seen that this government was perfectly capable of running a sound ship. And like you said, in fact, if anything, he didn't go far enough to affect their interests.
Yeah.
And I think they're scared that Claudia might. Because what I think as a result of this, there's just, I've read articles like, oh, what's Morena going to do without López Obrador? I think it's very much going to consolidate around Claudia Sheinbaum, around the project, around the movement, around this idea that the voters have delivered a mandate. And this mandate means we have to build, as she says, that second floor. What does that second floor imply for them? Maybe this time they're not just going to be excluded politically, but they're going to suffer economic consequences, and we're going to see a greater redistribution of wealth. That would be far more interesting. And I think a part of it is also they almost are particularly irked by somebody like Claudia Sheinbaum because she's supposed to be one of them.
She's supposed to be
She
one
comes
of them,
from a middle-class family.
Not like guy.
You're right. Yeah, she is of European descent. She's highly educated. This is supposed to be one of theirs. And ultimately, she's all the contrary. In fact, she came from the student movement. She's involved in struggle. Her parents educated her with values to actually attend to the people who are marginalized, who are made to suffer, and sympathizes and is on that side with them, and is therefore likely, if she wins, as we expect her to, when she governs, is going to govern for them. And once again, not only are they marginalized, but they're going to be further marginalized, this ruling class. And I think that
because they really haven't left themselves many open doors to negotiate, right? With this kind of the way these things are crashing and burning, right?
It means that they're going to be more isolated.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see because AMLO comes from, shop owner, lower middle class, provincial background, right? Yeah. So had to go to Mexico City and deal with these people as an outsider, which is one dynamic. Claudia grew up in the Mexico City greater metropolitan area, went to the UNAM and, as you say, is, familiar with the circles. So on one hand, she's closer to it, but on the other hand, she probably has very little illusions about these people because she knows exactly how they roll, right? All their intimacies, all their hypocrisies, all their bedroom scandals, She's around, she's been around that.
That's a really good point. Yeah. There's no surprises for her when it comes to dealing with these people. And obviously she said to herself, they've asked her, right? Because I think if you watch these pundits, they're so worried. They're like I mentioned in the last program, she doesn't even turn to look at them, right? They get so upset about this, right? And I think they're scared that she's not going to include them. But she's said to openly, she's like, listen, when you're president of everybody. There will be dialogue, there will be openness, but not around our principles, not around the core things. Right? If we want to engage with dialogue with the opposition, we'll have to, but not when it comes to sacrificing everything that we fought for to get to this point. And which I think that's what a good leftist program does, right? You govern for everybody, but you don't concede on the key points. And that's what we're likely to see. I wanted to move on here to talk about Jorge Álvarez Mañez, because I know we said it kind of tongue-in-cheek, but he ended up playing an interesting role in this election in that there wasn't a lot of expectations for him. His strategy obviously was limited by the fact that they're a much smaller party with much less financial resources. He clearly was making a pitch to young people, making a pitch to people who don't feel well represented by the opposition. And well, unfortunately, his campaign suffered some pretty bad news in this last week. And I wanted to put this scene up here on the screen for everybody.
Yeah.
So he was hosting an event in San Pedro Garza Garcia, which is the wealthy enclave of Monterrey. So it's a suburb, but it's part of the greater metropolitan area. Interestingly enough, it actually is a bit of like a base for Movimiento Ciudadano in that state in Nuevo León.
Actually, I think it's the wealthiest municipality in all of Latin America.
Oh, wow. Well,
If I'm not mistaken.
So
Per capita.
this was going to be a pretty important moment for them, kind of almost like not quite the campaign closing, but the regional campaign closing.
Yeah, and one of their bastions.
It looks like they didn't pay enough attention to the weather conditions because they set up the stage here, and then in the midst of a storm that rolled in, we see this happen. And these are powerful images. Unfortunately, we should
Terrifying.
mention, and our condolences to the family, this actually led to at least 9 deaths, some pretty major injuries. People are still hospitalized as a result. And unfortunately, as we see that this ended up kind of ruining their event here and taking away the headlines here. But what I wanted to talk about is that we can see, so I want to emphasize this is a pretty traumatic thing to happen. You know, this is meant to be a lively, exciting moment. Here are our candidates. Look, we've done better than people expected, et cetera, et cetera. And then quite a damper on that experience here. But then the reaction from these same people that we've just spent the last half hour criticizing has been atrocious. Disgusting is the word.
Yeah.
And this is a tweet from Álvarez Mañez himself, where he says, with these people, never, nowhere, for any reason. They have made the lowest campaign that I remember since 2006, showing their true face, hoping even that I would die. They don't care about the pain of others. They have been consumed by hate and by anger. And that lets to try to take advantage of this dirty campaign. And so I want to bring up the images that he's referring to. Now, most of these tweets have been deleted, right? But this was the immediate reaction, again, by this same group of people that we've been criticizing, the same people that are behind the opposition campaign. So we have Héctor de Mauleón, who is a right-wing pseudo-journalist who mostly predicates his political opinions as opposed to actually doing journalism. And he writes, oh, whoever can save themselves, and shows this images. And in this image, you can actually see Jorge Álvarez Mañez running away, trying to save his life, quite possibly did save his life by running away. And then quote tweeted by the world's worst human rights defender, Emilio Álvarez y Casa Longoria, who says, even nature tells them what is their path. Basically saying that this is an act of God to tell the world not to support Movimiento Ciudadano. Why? Because Movimiento Ciudadano refused to join the opposition coalition. Can you believe? I mean, how low do you have to go? Even if at the moment they say, oh, we didn't know the seriousness of it, Álvarez y Casa actually blamed his team. What a coward.
That's even worse. Yeah.
Way worse. At least accept that you overreacted in the moment. But no, it's the fault of my intern who runs my social media, right? Just atrocious kind of behavior, but it speaks to it. And I think Álvarez Mañez is right. It shows their true face. It shows what they're really about. It's what they've been showing us for this last 3 months. They don't actually care about the country. They don't care about the population. They don't even care about their own proposals. They just hate López Obrador, they hate Morena, and they hate anybody who gets in their way, in this case Álvarez Mañez and Movimiento Ciudadano, which refused to join their opposition coalition, and rightly so. It clearly has proven to be the correct strategy.
Yeah, it's their irrational hate that I mentioned just a moment ago, right? This is when you see, right, when you base a campaign on hate and something like this happens, this is when you see how ugly it really is, right? And this is one of the dangers of running a campaign off of hatred. right? Something like this happens, and you show your true faces, right? Here's Felipe, right, over here.
Same thing, right? Saying, oh, well, this just kind of supports my argument. They should have had a greater interest to join the opposition coalition. And there's a handful more here. Here, you mentioned him earlier. Oh, how funny. Minus asked in debate, who of the three candidates do you prefer to defend against organized crime, narcos? And here we can see definitively that he is not the best option. Why? Because he refused to allow the stage to crush him and kill him. I'm not sure what the logic there is behind. I mean, these people are, like you said, are irrational.
And the thing is the right wing in Mexico has spent the last several months, and indeed the last several years, complaining that supporters of the 4T are polarizing the country, right? The 4T is polarizing the country. AMLO is polarizing the country. AMLO's rhetoric is polarizing the country, right? Positing some kind of mythical, pre-AMLO Mexico where everybody held hands and sung Kumbaya, right? Without, killings, disappearances, tortures, drug wars, labor exploitation, practically slavery conditions, right? In a lot of areas, right? No, right? Obviously, polarization is structural and it has to do with classes, right? And that's always been around, right? Since the beginning of capitalism, even before. But no, to them, the polarization just began in the last few years. And these polarizing people who don't know their place, right?
Right.
Look at these people. Look at these people. Taking a tragedy where people died and trying to twist that for very mean campaign benefits. Because it's not like it's going to change much. It's not like they're going to win or even come close to winning. They're just upset with this small party for not joining their, coalition of the lost. Why would they want to join that coalition of the lost? Who's polarizing? Who's the polarizer? Who are the polarizers? The polarizers are the people up above with the power, and they always have been. And this shows that. An event like this.
They would prefer that we stay silent. Polarization to them is an absence of criticism of the exclusion that existed in this country before the arrival of López Obrador. So when they talk about polarization, what they're actually talking about is the fact that the poverty, the marginalization, the suffering, the exclusion had a name and that people could speak to it. They would have rather that they continue in their ignorance, pretending as if there was this magical moment where everything was positive and sunshine and happy and rainbows, when meanwhile the majority of the country was suffering. And people are going to remember that. And I think that's the thing that they were never able to actually wrap their heads around either. That when people feel seen, when there is a sense of dignity behind government policies to bestow upon them their rights, that people are going to remember that. And they're going to continue to support the people who did that, not the ones that shamed them for daring to pursue a different option, for denying them their entitlements.
And that's why, and maybe we can put up the poll number here too, why the polls have been so steady in this campaign. Right? I mean, they've been so steady, right? As opposed to, a lot of campaigns in, the U.S. and Western Europe now, where the polls gyrate because they're having to choose between imperial parties and parties that, don't represent or don't make them feel seen. The polls have been remarkably stable. Right?
Yeah, we have De Las Heras here
since years, but since the pre-campaign period of last year, they've hardly moved at all. Right?
No.
And that's a testament, of course, to the politicization of the Mexican public, and they haven't been swayed and thrown off by the foreign media attacks and, all this negative campaigning that we mentioned by Xochitl Gálvez, right? But it also has to do exactly what you said with this idea of being seen, a feeling that there's a sense of dignity. Mm-hmm. Right? You're included. So this is the poll here on the screen from De Las Heras,
Yeah, de las eras demotecnia. In fact, I was going to say, so the head of this group, he always comes out on Sin Embargo. I really appreciate the way he does because he just kind of, you can tell he's nonpartisan. He's just coming out there and he's like, listen, this is how I do polls. This is how it's done. This is what I'm trying to say. This is how I translate this terminology. I'm just trying to explain things. And I'm really grateful for the way he goes through the trouble of explaining for people who maybe not are familiar with methodologies and all the rest of it, right? And
Yeah,
in fact,
he talks it out. It's interesting. It's very
it out.
pedagogical, you know?
Yeah. And he's like, it's been a boring campaign. Right? It's funny when a pollster says
for
that.
pollsters, yes. Right.
He's like, it hasn't changed, and he's right. In fact, he always mentions, he's like, people are like, you must be paid by Morena. He isn't, right? And he's like, I'm just doing my job, and my job means that I have to break from my bubbles, and if you would do the same, you would find that you have the same results. And I find him to be the most trustworthy when it comes to actually reading the election. I kind of want to stay away from poll aggregates. I think it doesn't necessarily give you an accurate picture. I think it can confuse things. I do think that maybe he's overestimating the support for Claudia Sheinbaum. I don't think that on election day she's going to get quite as high as 64%. Things can really change on the actual day of the voting, but it's going to be close. I think ultimately, when we come back and look at the actual results, it's going to look very close to what we're seeing here on the screen. This is assuming a 54% participation rate, which is very important in terms of what the actual numbers will look like.
Which is actually kind of low itself and from Mexican historical norms. Mexico usually hovers around a 60%.
That's right.
Participation rate, and that would favor Morena, right?
Yeah.
This is the high end, the 36% lead by Sheinbaum. Other polls have her in the 20 to 25 region, right?
Exactly.
Right? Of course, the opposition wants to posit the state of Mexico scenario, where Delfina Gomez had a big lead going in and only won by 8 points, right? I think for a large variety of reasons, the presidential campaign is not the same as a state race, but that's what they're kind of clinging to her, right? Yeah, and this is, you can see how steady it's been over time, right?
Exactly, the evolution. If anything, this is the worrisome thing, right? You run negative. I mentioned it every time. I was like, Kurt hit the nail on the head. If you have bad approval ratings or favorability ratings, running a negative campaign might be the worst strategy you can employ. And you can see it here. Instead of growing, she shrunk. She lost support. And that's not really quite surprising to anybody who follows politics in a general way, or in the case here of Mexico. This was very much what was going to likely happen.
Because if she had just run a neutral campaign, the natural tendency of campaigns is to tighten over time.
Yes.
Right? Not that she was ever going to overtake Claudia Sheinbaum, but kind of the natural evolution of a campaign is to tighten over time. That didn't happen in 2018 here in Mexico, right? AMLO maintained his lead throughout, right? But she might have at least maintained the 35% she had back in February.
And remember,
now
this
she's
is
down
actually,
at least in this one to 28%.
That's
right?
less than they got last time. Because if you add up with the pre and then with the PAN, Movimiento Ciudadano, PRD coalition, they actually got more last time than 28%. So
That's
this
right.
whole strategy of running as a grand coalition of all the opposition also didn't really work out, which is, I'm not here to give advice to the opposition, but maybe you shouldn't be listening to Claudia X Gonzalez, a fail son, this junior who doesn't really know what he's doing, what he's talking about, and is driven by anger and resentment.
Or Jorge Castaneda, or Max Cortázar. I mean, it's just, who are these people that they entrusted the campaign to? I mean, a failure across the board, it has to be said, right? They were never going to win this campaign, but they could have come out of this with some reasonable numbers, some down-ballot successes, which remains to be seen, right? And some, at least a stepping stone going forward to the following campaigns. Instead, they're crashing out here. The PRD is very likely going to lose its public financing and disappear as a national party. Yes.
Please, I hope so.
The PRI is humiliated. They're going to be down around, 10%. The PAN is going to be equal. It's going to be much harder for them to rebuild, and great for us, because of this bad campaign. It's going to be that much harder for them to rebuild at all.
Yeah.
And that's when you say, as you said at the beginning of the show, campaigns actually do matter.
That's right. Can I, just as a side, speaking about the PRI, I think if the PRI ends up disappearing, it'll be over the long term. They'll likely survive this election. But I have this dream. They have these huge installation in the heart of the city, here in Mexico City, in the capital. I would love to see them disappear as a party, and we turn that into a new free university, because the installations are perfect for it. But that's me dreaming. And then I just wanted to also run down this one here. Do you approve or disapprove of President López Obrador? Which is, we should also recognize, not that he cast a shadow over the election, but obviously this was an election of, do you agree with the transformation or do you agree with the opposition? And we can see, right, when the president has 75% approval ratings, right, here on this graph, which only goes to August 2022, the lowest he ever went was 71. Mm-hmm. He's at 75 when, 3/4 of the country supports the president, and his president's party is running. Who do you think they're going to support? It wasn't that difficult to imagine. And
that's the thing that really boggles me. In their war room, you have to craft the campaign based on the circumstances that exist. And if you're running against a party whose incumbent president has a high approval rating, you can't run the angry campaign because the country isn't angry.
No.
It's as simple as that. The country isn't angry. You're angry, but the country isn't angry. It's not impossible to run a campaign in those circumstances, but it would have to have been a very different campaign from the one they chose.
Yeah.
Because their state of mind, this kind of meltdown we saw in the Claudia's video, simply is nowhere close to where the average Mexican is feeling. So he just looks ridiculous.
And then we have actually these scenes, on the other hand, which is Claudia Sheinbaum, very much, I think, there was a meme that was circulating around, which is just like, what do these candidates need to become president? And Xochitl Gálvez, it was like, oh, she needs to be smarter and less abrasive, and Álvarez Mañez or something else. And for Claudia Sheinbaum, they're like, what does Claudia Sheinbaum need? 8 days.
8 days. Yeah.
She's very much carrying herself now as somebody who is at the doorstep of victory, who's about to win. And I get it, right? Like, look, you can see these images from her campaign. You can see the massive turnout. So this is in Mérida, Yucatan, right? Look at that turnout. When have we seen a rally like this in Mérida? If anything, this kind of reminds me of Hugo Chavez during the height of his popularity in Venezuela, where no matter where the candidate goes, even these less populated countries, you have massive turnout, right? Like, look at it. This is Mérida, Yucatan.
Yeah, just for some context, the Yucatan in general is not a progressive bastion of Mexico. Quite the contrary. Mm-hmm. It has never been. There have been some historical moments, right? I'm not going to say never, but in recent years, it has not been a progressive bastion, right?
Yeah. In fact, they said the Mexican Revolution never made it to the Yucatan Peninsula, right? That's one of the sayings. That a lot of transformations happened, but it was one of the places that was least. And it's not just there, right? Here's an image from Rocío Nale, who's the candidate for governor in Veracruz. Same thing, right? We have massive
Jalapa, right? Yeah.
This is Jalapa. Extraordinary, right? People are genuinely mobilized, engaged, supportive, right? This isn't the acareos that they try to say that people are bussed in to be able to participate. No, this is a genuine outpouring. And I think a lot of it is partially motivated by the fact that, they feel like victory is just around the corner. And so
nothing succeeds like success, right? But still, this is something we mentioned in our respective articles after the campaign launch in March 1st, mine and Jacobin and yours and Al Jazeera. This is hard for people from the global north, the Anglophone world. I'm sure the global north is, has its I'm not going to try to generalize. The idea of a mass party, the idea of a mass movement, which simply just is outside of the conception of the United States at this point, right, or Canada. Right? So, to see these kind of numbers to turn out for a party is very hard for people up north to kind of grasp, I think.
And there is an energy to it, right? Mm-hmm. I always liken it to going to a concert. There's something about being in a space where everybody is gathered for the same reason, right? Under the same kind of motivations. Right. We have this last one from Chiapas, right? Yeah. We talked about the way that Xochitl didn't even mention the state she happened to be in until she was reminded of the fact. Again, Chiapas has a very different kind of left tradition, obviously the EZLN, et cetera, et cetera. But here we can see, again, mobilization of the population saying, we're with Claudia Sheinbaum. And I think that's also important because we were talking about turnout and the rest. what's the mandate? How many millions of votes is she actually going to get? So when you see this kind of, you can extrapolate something from that. You can extrapolate that these people, if they're motivated to show up to a rally in very hot weather, they're probably going to be motivated.
Yeah, it's been
on Sunday
exceedingly hot in Mexico over the last month. That's another point to mention, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, record heat. I mean, climate change and the like. But I mean, this has been happening in, places where records are being set for heat.
And then on this final one, you pointed out to me, I actually had missed this one. It's a bit of kind of the cut from the same cloth as López Obrador, where here we have Claudia Sheinbaum saying, this afternoon we recorded the podcast, and I put myself behind the wheel to drive to our next reading in Naucalpan, where I grew up as a child, and then don't miss the last episode of the podcast. But it's been interesting to see, right? You can see she's comfortable, she's happy, right? She knows she's about to become the president. Mm-hmm. And it's good, and it's nice to see, right? It's also kind of good that she remember her roots. Naucalpan is a inner suburb of Mexico City. It's kind of mixed income. They're very poor areas, but they're also wealthy areas, right? To see her, kind of eschew the big truck to take her to the campaign rally, driving up to herself. There's Epimeno Ibarra there in the background. You can see, I think it speaks to the mood inside the Morena camp, which is that they feel that they're going to win.
Yeah, and we're getting towards the end here, so I think maybe we can talk more in the live and maybe the next week as to how the Claudia campaign has rolled, because we've talked about in this episode about how the Xochitl Gálvez campaign went from bad to contemptible, right, and the mistakes, right. It would be good to talk about how in the following episode what the Claudia Sheinbaum campaign did well. I mean, the clear one is maintaining message discipline and not getting distracted by the attacks, right? But there's a lot more I think we can say about that. It's really been a focused, no-nonsense campaign, not flashy because it hasn't needed to be. And you really, for example, the policy rollouts for the Sheinbaum campaign, they coordinated them to the 3 debates. Mm-hmm. Right? Whatever the topics were the debate, those were the same topics that they were talking about, right, on their campaign stops. So a degree of thinking things out, right, and not just basing your campaign on what's called in Spanish the ocurrencia, right, mm-hmm. which is kind of whatever comes off the top of your head, or whatever the new attack line is, right?
Exactly.
Staying in your lane, basically. Staying in your lane, which, of course, is what you want to do when you're the front runner anyway, right? Stay in your lane. Yeah. We'll talk more about this in a future episode.
Absolutely. And to wrap up, well, as always, some of the favorite segment of some of our listeners and watchers out there, the losers and haters of the week. And oh boy, I think some of you may recognize the name of this one. None other than Andres Oppenheimer. Ugh. But anyway, what can we say? I mean, it's largely predictable. Bad news for democracy. Mexican presidential frontrunner might bring back Venezuela and Cuba. Oh, my goodness. I'll read this the lead real quick. Bad news for supporters of democracy across the Americas. Claudia Sheinbaum, the government-backed frontrunner in Mexico's June 2 presidential election, has suggested that if she wins, she will maintain Mexico's current support for Cuba, Venezuela, and other dictatorships. In the third and final presidential debate on May 19th, Sheinbaum said that we, quote, are going to maintain the foreign policy of the President of the Republic, end quote. Referring to the leftist populist President Andres Manuel López Obrador, she added that López Obrador's foreign policy is a medal of pride for Mexicans. And he goes on to talk about the same old, that anybody who doesn't kiss the feet of U.S. imperialism is a dictator, that anybody who doesn't belong to the club of pseudo-liberal democracies are also dictatorships, blah, blah, blah. Venezuela and Cuba are far more democratic than the United States, and I will go to my grave defending that concept. And so, I mean, it's to be expected. This guy always writes the same kind of, I feel like he throws darts against the wall to figure out his next column, and it's usually the same kind of topics. There's nothing new here, but I do think that it's worth pointing out because, well, this is now going to be the discussion after her more very likely victory on Sunday. It's going to be Mexico joins the club of the authoritarian dictatorships in Latin America, and therefore they deserve to be marginalized or sanctioned, and we need to rethink our economic relationship, et cetera, et cetera. You got to remember, the U.S.'s number one trading partner is not China, it is not Canada, it is Mexico. And so the relationship is actually very important to them. Oftentimes it's depicted as if, we have to always be, bowing before the hegemon. But no, they need us just as much as we need them. And so they would be careful to not go too far in their rhetoric and try to the same strategy that they've done with Cuba and Venezuela, because they'll end up shooting themselves in their own foot. But ultimately, I think this is part of it. And then we're going to see this. I think because there's likely going to be a landslide victory, we're going to see the opposition do what it does. It goes into its conservative strongholds. It's going to run into the arms of U.S. imperialism, and it's going to play the same tactics that we've seen in other places, like Bolivia, like Nicaragua, like Venezuela, where their emphasis is not so much on convincing the public and winning support and understanding and engaging in self-criticism and breaking out of your bubble. No, it's how dare these people take away what I feel entitled to. Therefore, I'm going to, even through unscrupulous, undemocratic means, try to figure out a way to get back into power.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason we chose this piece is because it's a very similar playbook to what we've talked about in previous episodes as to, how the conservative elites here have tried to mask their ideological disagreements with AMLO as concern for democracy, right? And their horror against creeping authoritarianism, right? The likes of Andres and Oppenheimer, they don't give two hoots about democracy. That's their argument to try to make themselves look noble. Doesn't like what's going on in Mexico because he disagrees ideologically with what's going on with the 4T, right? With the transformation of the country. But exactly like, the Maria Rosa and Denise Dresser, right, and Lorenzo Cordova and all these people, instead of just saying, I disagree with this country, with this government ideologically speaking, oh no, it's a concern about democracy. Please.
Save it.
Please, right? Like these people care about democracy, right? As our great friend Jeffrey Hermanson says, right? Where are Mexico's foreign bases and proxy wars? Where is Mexico interfering in the internal affairs of other countries? What subversive NGOs or opposition politicians are funded by Mexico? Right? That's intervening. That's intervening because the whole argument here is that, AMLO has intervened. You want intervention? How about what's going on in Rafah right now? Right now. Right? Contravening, the World Court ruling last week. You want interventions, right? It's just so laughably, pathetically absurd that in the context of all of U.S. history in Latin America, country after country, find one where they haven't, right, gone against democracy, the entire continent, he tries to play this card that Mexico or AMLO is interfering with democracy, right? I mean, it's just un-effing believable. And it's really like, right, the band that maybe you used to like when you were 20, and then you see them when you're 30, and you're like, well, and then, you see them when you're 40, you're like, these guys, they're not aging well. It's the same songs. And then you see them when you're 50, you're right, and the band, they got the long hair, and maybe the bald spot, and they got the paunch, right, and it's just not that band, because they're trying to live off their glory years. This is Oppenheimer. He's just trying to play the same old song. The same old song, and the world has moved on, baby. The world has moved way on, and in the last 6 months, it's moved on a lot faster. Because It's funny, I was reviewing some of his literature, right? Oppenheimer wrote a book in 1992 about Castro's final hour, the secret story behind the coming downfall of that regime. He was saying since 92 that Castro was going to fall. Didn't happen, right? He also wrote a book about Mexico's road to prosperity in the 90s. That didn't happen either. So, it's another one of these cases, just get everything wrong and fail upward to a CNN show. And try to just play your old tunes, right? The band just doesn't look that good anymore.
And I'm glad you mentioned Rafah, because just yesterday or over the weekend, The Atlantic published an opinion piece basically arguing that there is legality to killing children. This is the same Atlantic that'll send some of their small L liberal writers down to Mexico after Claudia Sheinbaum wins.
Sure, from an
Lament
apple bomb.
the decline, the authoritarian regression of Mexico. So remember, the people who are trying to justify the murder of innocent children are going to come and try to lecture us about democracy and human rights and the rest of it. And the Oppenheimers of the world will try to say that Mexico is wrong for maintaining diplomatic relationships with whatever country it chooses to keep diplomatic relationships with. And so be critical of their fellow travelers. Be critical of these voices. They're serving interests that are not immediately made evident in their writing. They're serving ruling class interests. And I think, like you said, the world is moving on. The less attention we pay to them, the less important they are. There's far more of us out here who want a better world, who want to end poverty, lift people up, who want to redistribute wealth, who want to use the resources for the good of the nation, for the good of the people, and not to line the pockets of a few, which is what was true before this transformation. Well, Kurt, that brings us to the end of another episode, our last episode of the campaign period for the 2024 election here in Mexico. Now, we made the commitment to do weekly programming during the election. You and I will have to figure out how much we want to be putting stuff out there, but we have the commitment to continue making this program because, well, elections are one thing, but politics doesn't stop. So we're going to need to keep going and covering Mexico. And you can always come to us here at Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast, to cover that. And of course, we'll see you on Sunday. It's going to be election night.
We don't know exactly what time. We don't know exactly what time, but we'll be on maybe a couple times, right? With some updates. We'll let you know on Twitter and wherever else, and then we'll have a full rundown in our regular show the following Monday, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take advantage of the opportunity and say like, subscribe, hit the bell icon to let us know when we'll be going live as well, so you can hear back this feedback. Of course, we'll be on the ground on Sunday. It's going to be a very long day for some of us. Kurt actually is going to come into the city in the afternoon. He's going to vote in the mornings. Likewise, in the morning, first thing, I'm going to go to my polling location, cast my ballot. But then it's going to be about being on the street, being out there, and also paying attention because, as we said, the opposition is driven by this kind of hatred, and there are some rumors that there could be some electoral violence here in the capital coming from certain sectors. There may be cries of fraud. There is precedent in Latin America of electoral violence when the result does not favor these interest groups. So we'll be on the lookout for that. But we're hoping that everything turns out positively for the country, positively in terms of a lack of violence. We hope there isn't a lot of those kinds of things to report about, and instead we'll be talking about, well, what do the people have to say, right? Because we'll be on the ground. We're going to be in the Zócalo following the release of the election results. Thanks again for joining us.
Sunday. Take care.
We'll see you Sunday.